the end of the evening. So I'm James. I'm the CTO of a company called Cynozure. I'll talk a little bit more about us in a second, but my talk today is going to be on whether open source is for you as a business and how that impacts your team if you decide to kind of go down that route. I figured we were going to have lots of good talks on the engineering side, the software side, so I'd try and bring a little bit of a different angle to it that's kind of based on a lot of my experience and my job. So I'm the CTO at Cynozure, and we are a data analytics strategy consultancy with a real disregard for child labour laws. So what that means is my teams go around to a lot of different businesses of all kinds of sizes, from small scrappy startups to FTSE 10 kind of businesses, and you get a whole range of different problems, different legacies, different requirements. And we spend a lot of time helping people craft their data strategies, and a big part of that is helping them figure out what technology they're going to need in order to deliver all the things that they want to do with data. And while open source is incredibly popular among developers, it's not always incredibly popular among boards, executives, CTOs, CIOs who have to make all those risk assessments and decisions that they can get fired on if they screw up. So I wanted to talk through and take a look at how you think about open source, how to approach that problem of picking technology generally for you, and the pros and cons to consider as you go through it, what that's going to mean for your team as you're trying to build out a data team or whatever you want to call it, and whether you should maybe think about open sourcing your own code and why you would want to do that in the end. So I was going to start originally with a definition of open source, but I thought that's really boring. What I'll do is instead my degree is in international history and politics, which is, I'm assuming, what everyone who does engineering has done. So I thought I'd take a look at what's actually the background of open source and where does that come from and how we got to where we are today. So I was actually kind of a bit surprised when I look back that software started free. What you're really buying was a piece of really expensive machinery, and they gave you the machine code that ran on it, but they also gave you the open source code, the human readable things, so that you could go make whatever changes you actually needed to make it run and do the thing that you'd try to do it. So really, from a commercial perspective, code started free and it started open, and you could modify it and you could hack it and you could do what you wanted with it. And that lasted for a little while. But towards the end of the sort of 60s, that started to change. That started to decline. More and more companies were starting to lock down their code and recognize it as a commercial asset. But it wasn't actually until 1974 that you could copyright code, at least in the US. So before that, it was just it's a thing, it's not yours, but there's a group set up, a US government agency, to look at this, and they decided actually, yeah, code's copyrightable. It's an asset. It's someone's it's IP, and they can close it down and stop doing it. And so that really pushed this trend into code was closed. You bought this thing, you didn't know how it worked, you couldn't unpick it, you couldn't reuse it, you couldn't adapt it. And kind of in reaction to that, in the 1980s, we got the GNU project, and a couple of years after that, the Free Software Foundation, which was a kind of real reaction to saying, hang on, this isn't good, this isn't where code came from, this isn't what code should be, we want to make it open, we want to make it free for people to use and to work with and to hack around and play with. GNU project, if you don't know, is a brilliant name because it's a recursive acronym, so it's GNU's not Unix. It just infinitely goes around. So if you ever want to really annoy people with your project names, build a recursive acronym for it. In the 90s, we got Linux, and that was obviously a massive kind of step forward in the way that people approached open source and sharing and collaborating, just because it was such a big deal. So many people were starting to pick it up, use it, and share. But it's not really until the end of the 1990s when Netscape open sourced Netscape Communicator that we really got open source as we know it today. And that was in part in reaction to a really great essay at the time, The Cathedral and the Bazaar, which if you've not ever read or looked at, I highly recommend you check out, which looks at learnings from building open source software and how to approach projects and be really successful with it. And that kind of validated a lot of the conversations going on in Netscape about why they should open source and share their software. And they put it out there, and that really led to where we are today in how we approach and how we think about open source stuff. But how do you know if you should use open source? How do you know whether you should buy Microsoft SQL Server, or whether you should go to Oracle, God forbid, or whatever it is? How do you know that open source is a good choice for you? Because not every company is very digital, very startup-like, very kind of open and prepared to work in the kind of way that open source often dictates that you need to work. So it's not going to be right for everyone, but it's going to be right for a lot of people. So the first thing I always think about when we talk to people about what they need to select, what they need to think about when selecting technology, is just some general things they need to ask themselves. So the biggest, most important one is, well, what are you trying to do with data in your organization? What's the use case? What are you actually trying to deliver? Do you just need to deliver a little report to someone on Monday that shows how much you sold last week? Or are you trying to stream billions of rows, make real-time recommendations to hundreds of thousands, millions of users? And you've got an incredibly complex solution and problem that you need to work with. So there's loads of different things that you need to kind of ask yourself as you're going in. I think there's a few really key ones in there that are quite big drivers. So number one thing for me is what's your use case? What are you trying to do? But big data in quotes is, are you dealing with massively high volumes of data? Because that's going to really dictate some of the tooling you might want to do. Security is a really big thing. We'll talk a bit more about security in terms of open source later, but that's a really important question to ask yourself, because if you need to build Fort Knox of databases, you're going to pick something different to if you've got far less confidential data. If your exposure and attitude to risk is a bit lighter, you don't need to worry nearly as much. And is it suitable for operational support? So can you actually deploy this thing and make it run in your business and deliver stuff to people day to day? Understanding the kind of stuff that's up on the screen there will just help you get a baseline about what is it you're trying to achieve and give you some direction on the kind of things you might need to be looking at in the market and that might be suitable for you. So now you're at a point where you go, I kind of understand the problem I'm trying to solve, and I kind of understand the technology options out there, but should I buy open source, or not buy open source, but should I use open source, or should I go to a vendor and buy some kind of platform from them? So you've got to think about the trade-offs, and the big first one, and what drives a lot of people to open source, is the cost. So the initial cost on open source is great, and it's free. You can download it, you can start using it the next day. It's great. That's really easy to start using and to get access to. You don't need to go getting approvals for buying some expensive piece of software, the 3-year license term and so on. But what's often overlooked with open source is that long-term cost. So it's not going to stay free forever. And that doesn't mean you're going to start paying for the software. But at some point, you're going to start paying for how you support it, the kind of people you need to run that and use that effectively, the kind of hardware and services that you need to run on it. And a lot of those can be really hidden at the start and really hard to predict. So this is a kind of very much an attitude to risk thing. It's like, how prepared are you for long-term variability in what your cost is going to be for something? Transparency of code versus lack of documentation. So great, hopefully well-written code can explain itself, and you can go in and you can look. If you don't understand how something works, you can actually go and just read and figure it out. But, and this obviously varies massively from project to project, you might find that you get very light documentation that comes with it. That means that's a lot of upfront work to figure out what's going on, to understand everything that's in there, to train up members of your team, to explain what the thing does to people. So there's very much a balance there that's going to be driven a lot by the kind of skills you have access to in your team. So fast-moving updates and reliability is definitely that's one of the big things. That's why one of the big reasons to go open source. You're getting access to a big team of people. They're all contributing stuff, they're adding new features, they're spotting bugs. That's all brilliant. But if you don't pick carefully, you can end up with an orphan project because the developers get bored because it's a really dull thing that they've come up with and something better has come up. By that point, you've just integrated it into your most key important workflow, and nobody is now updating the source, and you're left with this thing that's like, oh my God, I either have to redevelop it, or I now effectively own that, and I'm going to have to completely look after this thing. Obviously, there's ways to mitigate this, which is take a sensible look at what the community looks like behind that project and see whether there's a good deal of contribution going on with it. Is it well adopted by a number of different companies out there that can give you a good, safe feeling that this isn't going anywhere anytime soon? For instance, I don't think we're all worried about Spark suddenly not having anyone contributing to it or working to it. So security is really interesting when you read around open source, because people's immediate reaction to security in open source is it's got to be bad, it's open, right? People can see how the thing works. And of course, bad actors are always going to be able to take that and use that to their advantage, whether that's finding holes or whether that's becoming a contributor and inserting something somewhere in the system that's a backdoor for them, that's a piece of malware that perhaps doesn't get caught, doesn't get picked up, and you've just now installed it and patched your system with it. But the general prevailing opinion out there is that open source is generally more secure because of the many eyes that are on it. So when you're picking a really well adopted project that's got a lot of users and a lot of people looking at it, people catch these things, people spot these things. You've got dozens, maybe hundreds of security teams out there doing penetration testing for you and finding problems and making sure that that's then contributed back and fixed. So you can really take advantage of that to make sure you've got strong, secure software, perhaps in a way that you couldn't manage to test and check yourself. So I kind of mentioned earlier on that there's a bunch of surveys out there that show just how popular open source code is with developers. It's kind of hands down what people want to code with, what people want to work with. So it's really attractive for trying to recruit and build a data team or an engineering team if you're working with open source. I mean, I'm sure we could all name some vendors that we wouldn't want to use their software, we wouldn't want to go near them, that we're going to struggle to find the right type of people to work with us if we are using a certain thing. And ultimately, the culture and the type of people you build in the team is going to be way more important to how successful you are than the specific software you pick. So making sure you're bringing the right people in and doing everything you can to find those people, including picking tools that are interesting, that people want to use, want to work with, want to learn, is really important to building it. But it's way harder for less skilled teams. So not every business has the luxury of hiring a dozen experienced data engineers. They might be working with members of staff who've not ever worked with open source before and been used to just dealing with a nice proprietary piece of software that gives them a lovely front end and that they don't have to worry remotely about how it works, how it updates, how it patches, how security works. They can just use a front end. Maybe they're just writing a bit of SQL. It's really easy for them to use. And the moment you give them open source and they're suddenly responsible for the entire system fundamentally, that's a completely different ballgame, and that can make adoption really, really difficult for some users. And it's worth thinking of this not just in terms of your immediate data team who are dealing and working with these to build your data pipelines or whatever it is, but also thinking about it in terms of your end users. So you're getting data out to customers somewhere in your business, whether that's through reporting, whether that's through direct access for data science teams, whether you're sending data to some downstream system. And you need to think about those teams as well. Are they going to be able to use what you've created and what you've given them? Or is your entire business skilled up in a certain thing and you've just tried to give them something that's completely different that they've never seen before and that's just about to slow everyone down for the next year while they all complain to you that the new system's horrible and they want you to put back the old one? Vendor lock-in, huge one for people going open source. You're not locked into a vendor. You haven't just signed a 3-year deal and given your life away to Microsoft or anyone else. You can switch out at any time you want to do something else, but this comes at the cost of support, typically. That's a really, really massive one. I'm going to talk about that a bit more in a second, but that's a really massive one for people picking open source. there's a really good reason people buy SQL Server, why they buy Oracle, why they go to these vendor proprietary platforms. And that's because there's someone on the end of the phone that they can ring up and they can shout at and they can get in. I'm sure we've all heard the phrase, no one's got fired for buying IBM, which is...
I've heard it for Oracle.
You've heard it for Oracle, yeah. It started with IBM, but it's moved around in its use. And that's a fear, uncertainty, and doubt settling tactic. Where that came from, that didn't come from things being brilliant. That came from, hey, Mr. Buyer, you could go with our competitors or you could go with us, and we're really reliable, and your board know who we are, so you're not going to get fired for buying us if things go wrong. That's a massive, massive thing if you are the CIO, the CTO of your business, whatever it is, and you're making these selections and you're picking these things, because ultimately, this is a large project. You're going to have to justify this stuff, and if it goes wrong, you're really going to have to justify why you did these things. And not being able to support a product that you've bought is the kind of thing you get fired for. So this is one of the big drivers for people not going open source. So what are your options? How do you, if you go open source, deal with this? Because I go into companies of all kinds of sizes who can afford teams from 1 person through to 1,000. They've all got different needs, they've all got different things they need to support. When they use open source software, they've got a few routes they can take with it, basically. So, number 1, you can support it yourself. You can hire the right people, you can skill them up, you can give them the time, you can make sure you've got the roles in your team, and you can look after that and make sure that you're skilled up in the things that you've deployed in your system. And then when something goes wrong, you don't need any help. You can go in and you can fix whatever's wrong. 2, sometimes you can pay the project sponsor. This isn't always available, but sometimes you'll have the option to go out to the key sponsor for it and pay them to provide you some support if you need it. That's probably not going to be scalable if you're a really big business with a really high demand. The 3rd one, you can go for a commercial support contract. There's plenty of companies out there that will take your money and provide you a support desk, skilled up with people who know the stuff you've deployed, and they can jump in when anything goes wrong and fix it for you. The 4th one is a really popular route in terms of the kind of places I go. They often go down the sort of enterprise open source route. So if you think of like the Clouderas, Hortonworks, Databricks, Kinesis, HD, Insights, all those kind of ones where you get an open source code base. It's the same thing that is being used in all these other platforms that you can go download from Apache. But what they've done is put their enterprise wrapper around it. What you're really paying for is not the software, you're paying for the support and maybe some nice front ends that they've built. But what you get with it is the feeling of buying a proprietary system with a support desk and a license and an agreement in place and a throat to choke. But you're also still in an open source world, so you're working with tool sets that are the same if I were to go to Apache and download it. And normally with those companies as well, they'll be big contributors to the specific source project. So you look at Cloudera, they created Impala, they put Impala into Apache, they maintain the biggest contribution to evolving that product. So in terms of our risk of picking a tool, we can be pretty sure that Cloudera aren't about to abandon that anytime soon. You've got Databricks and Spark, same kind of story. So that's a really, really common route I see people take, is that kind of enterprise version that's a nice, take an open source project, wrap it up and sell it to people. So if you've gone open source, if you've gone through all of those and you've decided that on balance, open source is the thing for you, this is the technology you want to be using, this is great, then it's going to have some impact on your team. So I break that down into these kind of 3 areas. So first is the skills. You're going to need to train some of your people, in all likelihood. Probably not everyone is going to have used the things that you're using, is going to know how to make them work. There's going to be people that you need to bring along, whether in the immediate team or in the sort of wider business community. And it's probably going to bring with it some new roles, because you suddenly need a support desk, you need administrators and so on that can actually run this software on a day-to-day basis and make sure that systems are up. And those might not already exist in your business because you've been using off-the-shelf software that you don't need to kind of worry about that as much. And really importantly, I think a different mindset. So we talked about that kind of contribution back to open source software, and I think if you are adopting it, then you should really be taking an approach that says, I'm going to contribute back to this, I'm going to help keep this alive, I'm going to help improve this. Prior to Cynozure, I was at Marks & Spencer. I built the big data platform there. I know one of our guys was using the Impala connector, which is for Python and Impala and hooking them up. And he found like a massive hole when we were doing performance testing in the source code for Impala, and he went in and corrected it on our side and submitted it back to the project, and eventually gets accepted and pushed through, and it was something like a 4 or 5 times improvement in terms of the speed of the thing he's done. And that for me was how open source should work. It's not just about taking, it's about giving back as well. That's how we keep these things alive and how we keep them evolving, and that's the real value in open source. If it becomes a one-way thing, open source is going to die, and people need to kind of really think about that when they go down this route. They need to make sure they make the time, they drive that kind of culture in their teams. From the planning side, you probably need to think about disaster planning, perhaps even a little bit more than you normally would with a proprietary off-the-shelf thing. You need to make sure you've got time to understand the code, because you're going to need to get to grips with the fundamentals of what you're actually running a lot more than you perhaps would when you can't see all the detail about how it's running. And you're going to need to do some redundancy planning. So sometimes something's going to get orphaned, something's going to decline, something's going to have a problem, and you need to probably think about a way out and a constant evolution to stay on top of this stuff. And then costs for your team. So support, you need to think about how you're going to support that thing, whether it's any of the 4 options that you've done. Ultimately, you're going to have to pay to support it, whether that's through hiring or whether that's through paying some third party to do it for you. That needs to be thought about early on in your life cycle. You're probably going to need additional headcount. It's likely that you'll need a slightly bigger team to cope with the use of it and take full advantage of it. And you're going to have to think about budgeting, because your costs are likely to be a little bit more variable and unpredictable looking ahead, as you're not just on a nice, clearly laid out license terms of agreements on a specific set of machines that you're running that gives you a really predictable run rate for the next 2-3 years, however long you're signing for. The last thing I wanted to look at was whether you should open source your code. So really, the big question is, why should you open source your code? Just doing it for the sake of doing it is probably not a good idea, like many things in life. So you need to ask yourselves a few questions about what actually you're trying to achieve by putting your source code out there. I mean, I've seen a lot of small businesses open source bits of their code, and you never really know how much adoption that kind of thing's got. People are potentially going to steer clear because you go, well, there's not many contributors, it doesn't look like a big project, so these things are often hard to get off the ground. You might be doing it because you go, I've got a bit of a smaller team, we built something cool, this is a way to get extra developers and extra eyes and features on it because we think we've built something really good that people need, that fills a gap in the market and solves a problem, but it would develop a lot faster and be a lot more useful to me if I had other people outside saying, hey, why don't you do this, that, and the other to it? It might be about attracting talent to say, actually, as a developer, you're going to come here and you're going to be able to really work on this stuff and not just build applications with it, but develop that source. Get that on your resume as a developer, that you are a contributor to whatever project it is, and make it a differentiator in a really crowded market for data engineers and software engineers at the moment. Sometimes you're doing it because you want to build a market, because you think this is a product that as an organization you could ultimately find a way to monetize and build something out of, but you need to get that traction first, get people using it out there so that you can actually build a market for yourself. And then the final one on the list there, security holes. Lots of businesses don't have big cybersecurity teams. If you can get enough traction with your project, it's a good way to get other people looking for holes in it to see if you've got any major issues that you need solved, and you can get a lot more eyes on your code, looking for problems or looking for new features or whatever it is. So just kind of wrap up on that. I'm a massive fan of open source. I think it's the way that more and more organizations are going to be going. whether that's through those hybrid kind of options or whether they go in pure open source right from the source. But for a lot of organizations, and when you're out there in future roles and you're in a greenfield project and you're trying to make a decision about what technology you should be using, I would caution you not to just rush blindly in and use whatever you've heard your friends are using at other places or what you've seen and read about on LinkedIn or wherever it is, and take the time to think about what's right for the place you are, where are they trying to get to. When you think about all these kind of things, the pros and cons, the type of problems you're trying to solve, does open source make sense for your organization, or are you building yourself into a corner that you can't possibly live with in a year's time? I'm pretty sure I forgot to put a Q&A slide on the end, so I'll wrap up there, but if there's any questions, I'd be glad to take them.